Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu, and good afternoon. Firstly, I'd like to welcome to all the attendees, our live viewers on British Muslim TV, and also our esteemed guest speakers, who we will introduce to everyone shortly. So we are here today to officially launch the Islamophobia Awareness Month campaign here in Yorkshire. I am Muhammad Abu Bakr, the MEND Yorkshire and Humber Regional Manager, as well as an Imam. So Islamophobia Awareness Month is also known as I AM. It was co-founded by MEND and also alongside other British Muslim organisations in 2012 to deconstruct and challenge the stereotypes about Islam and Muslims. The campaign is held every November and aims to work with police and crime commissioners, local councils, journalists, local media outlets, councillors, local MPs, universities, mosques, schools, community organisations and many others to raise awareness of the threat of Islamophobia and encourage the wider community to work together to bring a change in which everyone is treated fairly and equally. Before we begin, firstly, I just want to thank Leeds Grand Mosque for allowing us to have the event at this prestigious masjid in Leeds. Firstly, thank you very much to all our guest speakers for attending today. Just to give a brief introduction regarding everyone to our attendees and our live viewers. So today we have with us Richard Burgeon, the Member of Parliament for Leeds East and former Shadow Secretary of State for Justice. We have Professor Salman Sayyid, the Chair in Rhetoric and Decolonial Thought and the Head of the School of Sociology and Social Policy at the University of Leeds. He is also the founding editor of Reorient, an international journal published biannually on the newly emerging field of critical Muslim studies. We also have with us Javid Bashir, the Chair of Calderdale Liberal Democrats and Parliamentary Spokesperson. He is also an Innovation Advisor at the University of York. He has a passion for making the Yorkshire region a real economic powerhouse and levelling up left-behind market towns. And we have Sister Maysoon Shafiq, the founder of Al Mu'minun, the Believers, a non-profit organisation dedicated to serving the youth through open spaces of spirituality, dialogue and empowerment. She actively works in the community to promote inclusivity and diversity by educating and eradicating myths pertaining to Islam specifically. She has received several awards for her work in breaking down cultural barriers and has recently written and independently published her first book titled First Steps in Understanding Islam. And finally we have Reverend Heston with us, the Vicar of All Hallows Church in Hyde Park. Reverend Heston is actively involved in community and interfaith relations and projects. We have an apology from Aisha Iqbal Khan, who unfortunately could not make it today, hence we only have our 5 guest speakers. So without taking any more time, we want to come straight into the subject of today, talking about Islamophobia and this discussion around Islamophobia, about how we can make a change, how we can raise this awareness and create this society where Muslims are not targeted for being who they are. So I want to come straight on to Professor Salman Sayyid. There's been numerous discussions around Islamophobia, what it is, how it should be defined, whether it should be defined, and many other things around this topic. And the APPG on British Muslims has recently defined Islamophobia as rooted in racism and is a type of racism that targets expressions of Muslimness or perceived Muslimness. So what I want to ask you is that why is it important to recognize and understand Islamophobia as a form of racism?
I think there are 2 reasons why it's important to understand Islamophobia as a type of racism. One is to do with the history of anti-racist struggle in this country. Over the period of the last 50 years or so, there have been lots of attempts made to fight against racism in all walks of life. And as a consequence, 2 things have happened. One, most people in this country now have some understanding of what racism is. And so much so that if you go to, for example, football matches, especially maybe elite clubs, you'll have fans being able to call out if someone is behaving in a racist way. If you go back to some of the early black footballers in the 80s and the 90s, this was never recognised. They had horrible epithets thrown at them, bananas thrown at them, and everyone thought it was a bit of fun. So, but that education now has gone across all levels of society, so people know what racism is. They know that in schools, they know in hospitals, they know in all walks of life. They may not be able to define it legally, but they kind of can point it out and say what it is. So if you think of Islamophobia as a type of racism, you're basically tapping into all of that struggle, all of that work, all of that education in the society. And secondly, related to this, is, well, it is a type of racism. And what I mean by that is Islamophobia, all organisations now, large organisations, have commitments, whether they carry them out or not, from the police to NHS, to combat racism. But they also have machinery in place. They have people who are trained in doing that, they have administrative processes. So if an instance of racism comes in, there's at least a way for them to go through the processes and procedures. Now we can criticise whether it's effective enough or whether it does what it's supposed to do, but at least it's a process. So by understanding Islamophobia as racism, what you do is say you don't need to know about fiqh, you don't need to know about the Quran, you just need to understand the effects of this. You don't need to be a theologian to understand what Islamophobia is. If Islamophobia is a type of racism, that means it's a discriminatory practice which we know exists, and we have a rough idea of how to start the conversation to deal with them. So I think it's really, really important that we understand Islamophobia as a type of racism. The final thing I would say is this: anyone who's a Muslim, however they may be, wherever they come from Bosnia, then they come from Senegal, then they come from Bangladesh. When you go through airports, there is a process which works out how you're a Muslim and how you may be treated. There is a phenomenon of flying while Muslim, for example. And if that doesn't show you how racism works, what will? So we already have the racialization of Muslims. So we have the racialization, we have the means to combat it, we have a record of combating it. It seems to me like talking about Islamophobia as a type of racism, we put all the pieces in place to actually improve the lives of not just Muslims who are affected by Islamophobia, but the consequences of Islamophobia are across all of society. So that's why I think we should understand it as racism.
Thank you very much, Professor Salman Saeed. Richard, can I bring you on there? Anything that you have extra to add on to that?
Yeah, well, that's a fantastically useful introduction, because, of course, Islamophobia has to be understood as a form of racism, because if it's not understood as a form of racism, then it's clear that the action that's necessary to root it out of society and our institutions won't take place. Obviously, as a politician who represents an area in Leeds which includes a thriving Muslim community in Harehills, I very often have discussions with constituents about Islamophobia that they face. But of course, they don't just face Islamophobia in their day-to-day lives in terms of with people they may bump into, in services they access, in shops, institutions. They face Islamophobia in terms of the mainstream press, in terms of the rhetoric of politicians as well, and the assumptions made by the press and by politicians. So Islamophobia is pushed by powerful voices in society. And racism, whether it be Islamophobia or anything else, doesn't come from nowhere. The conditions of racism and the ideas of racism are actually nurtured by those in powerful positions. And that's why it's a particular duty on politicians and journalists to expose Islamophobia and speak out against it. Now, as a Member of Parliament who's very interested in the way the economy works, of course I always believe that racism is exacerbated and intensified in periods of economic difficulty, because people are looking for a reason why there aren't enough houses, a reason why public services are underfunded. And if people don't speak out against it, then people will start to listen to the siren voices of racists and of the right. But it's an oversimplification to say that that's the only reason. Because if that was the only reason, then in times where the economy isn't in difficulty, there wouldn't be racism at all. So taking it back even just a few years further, of course racism intensified following the banking crisis, and many right-wing newspapers and many extreme politicians took advantage of that. But before that, the so-called war on terror actually encourages Islamophobia in our society. Why? Because Muslims had to be dehumanised, Muslims had to be scapegoated in order to gain public support for some of the foreign interventions that were taking place. If you can't other the people you're doing these things to, then perhaps you may object to it more, worrying about the fates of civilians in other countries, worrying about what happens in other countries if we, for example, invade Iraq, if we, for example, occupy Afghanistan, or if, for example, we get involved in the military intervention in Libya. So both the international policy, I would say, of successive UK governments and the international policy of successive US governments and their cheerleaders in the mainstream media have all contributed towards a rise in Islamophobia in this country in recent decades, and we see it on the rise again now. And of course, we see it in countries all around the world. And just been mentioned the experience in airports. I remember when I went as part of a delegation to Israel and Palestine, and the MP who got the most difficult of the authorities over there was Imran Hussain, the MP from Bradford. And I remember when we were going back to the airport to fly out of Tel Aviv, the car we're in was stopped. They asked for all our papers, and the person they didn't believe was an MP was Imran Hussain. He couldn't quite get the head around that for some reason. And that's just one example. It happens in Israel, it happens in Britain, it happens in the United States, it happens around the world. And we see in the newspapers, don't we, the automatic equation or equating of Muslim people in this country with acts carried out by regimes abroad. Now, we shouldn't have to say this, but just as a Jewish person living in Leeds has nothing to do with the crimes of the Israeli government, in the same way, somebody living in Hareholt, who happens to be Muslim, has got nothing to do with the royal family in Saudi Arabia. They're not responsible for the bombing of Yemen. They're not responsible for the way people are treated in Saudi Arabia. And all of these things get mixed up in the press to the extent that we see Muslims demonised, Jewish people demonised, other minorities demonised. But in terms of the subject of this discussion today, it's absolutely vital that organisations like MEND work with the community to call out Islamophobia and hold people to account for it. And I think it's wonderful that the way MEND previously has set out a way that people can make complaints about the coverage of the Muslim community on the BBC or other press organisations. That's really important. And we can't have a situation, and I will just give the example of politicians here. I don't think the world revolves around politicians, but obviously I speak to my friends who are MPs who are Muslim a lot. Why is it the case that if an MP is a Muslim and they're a man, that it's assumed that they're sexist until they prove otherwise? Why is it the case if someone's a Muslim and an MP that it may be assumed that they're anti-Semitic unless they prove otherwise? These are the things that in the right-wing press are pushed. And, we can't assume these things. We can't assume these things in relation to the Jewish community, in relation to the Muslim community, in relation to any community. It's pushed primarily by the right-wing press. So I think this meeting is an important part of standing up against that prejudice and discrimination and racism, but also organising against it. Organising against it is very important. If we don't call out public broadcasters and TV stations and journalists when they engage in Islamophobic, anti-Semitic or other racist reporting, so-called reporting, then they'll carry on doing so. We can't rely, unfortunately, on someone else to sort this out. As a community, we need to sort it out together.
Thank you very much, Richard. Javed, I just want to bring you on here, continuing on the discussion of the definition of Islamophobia. The APPD definition is being adopted by many local councils nationwide. However, unfortunately, Yorkshire has still got a far way to go in comparison to some of the other regions. So why do you think that is, and what message would you give to those councils who are still to take action in tackling Islamophobia?
Thank you for the question, and it's not a straightforward answer. The biggest issue, I think, within Yorkshire is there are a number of councils that have adopted the APPG version of the definition of Islamophobia. My local borough, Corvid, has adopted it, and so has Bradford. Naturally, with it being a large Muslim population, you'd expect them to be one of the first ones to call out, adopting that particular definition. I think one of the major challenges that we've got is the last 12 months, 18 months, because of the pandemic, there's been a big issue in terms of how local governments and how local organisations and institutes have been managing and organising themselves, and they just physically haven't had the time. There is a lot of politics being in play here as well at the same time. One of the sort of sad situations are that Yorkshire predominantly is a Labour. It's full of Labour leadership, whether it's at the local council, whether it's at the regional level, whether it's at the police and fire commission level. So it would have been nice and it would have been natural for them to adopt the definition as soon as it was accepted by the All Parliamentary Group, which it's got quite an impressive list of people that actually came together over the 2-year period in which it actually did its consultations, spoke to people. And one of the key things of the definition itself is that it's not something that was actually borne out on the back of previous works. There was a lot of groundwork that was done in understanding not the empirical evidence of what's going on, not in the UK but around the world, but also the lived experience of people that gets lost in all these conversations. Bringing it back to the local level, it's difficult because there's an issue of who's in charge of the local council and who can actually put forward a motion to adopt this. And one of the things I found is that nobody to date has actually turned up and said, or stood up and said, we will accept the APPG version of the definition as it stands without any preconditions. It always has to be buttressed up, or it has to be piggybacked on the back of something else. So, for example, one of the press releases was about, by a Labour, nothing to do with Richard or anything, trying to make this as less party political as possible, but Labour is the ones that are in charge, so it's on the onus is on them. But they will say things like, oh, we will accept APPG version of Islamophobia, but we'll also accept the anti-Semitism definition as well. So it's not a simple case of but one will go on, it only has to be backed up with another one. So it's the same thing with other organisations as well, that when they're accepting the definition, there's a political play that's going on. The ones putting the motions forward are elected candidates for political parties within their constituencies or their wards, so they have to be mindful about what they're putting forward and whether they're going to be unelectable next time round in an election taking place, and what are the actual collective political calculations of the party itself. Does it affect them moving forward? Can they actually sort of get this passed through the number of votes that are available? So there's a lot of politics that is involved in adopting this. So one of the key messages is about leadership more than anything else. So stand up. Yeah, if you've acknowledged that there is an issue, and if you say that there is no room for racism in our society in any form, you should be able to accept it and adopt it standalone without any of the preconditions.
Thank you very much for that, Javed. Now, we've heard from our three guest speakers, and they mentioned quite a bit about it being sort of the political issues surrounding Islamophobia, due to which sometimes it's not being tackled as much as it should. And a lot of the decisions made in this country are made on the back of our local MPs, the local councillors, and sometimes what's actually happening on the ground is not really seen, and how that's affecting the community is sometimes missed. So, Maysoon, I want to bring this. I want to bring it to you. Is in regards to the local Muslim community, what are the challenges that the local Muslim community is facing, and what do you think the solutions are? Are the political parties a solution?
Okay, so I think firstly there are several challenges that the community are facing at grassroots level. And firstly, being a female Muslim myself, I find it really proud and an honour to be able to adopt the hijab and my Muslim dress code when I am out and about. But there have been several cases, even when I've been working as a chaplain for the NHS, that I've had to do my ward rounds, and I've been asked by the nursing staff, by the medical staff, when no patient visitors have been allowed at the height of Covid, as to who I am, what department I've come from, and what am I doing on the wards. So I have to, in addition to my counterpart colleagues, I have to constantly remind them that I am a Muslim chaplain working for the NHS, and I am here to do the job and assist the medical staff. So that's my personal experience. But in terms of the community, I have had youth members, girls, come up to me saying they can't adopt the hijab, they can't wear the Islamic dress for fear of hate crime, for fear of being bullied. They have to adopt and fit in with society, things that they don't want to do, and they have to almost mellow down to the terms of their peers, which they wouldn't want to do otherwise. We also have the prevent policy in schools, and there are several students who have come up to me, because I work with the youth, and they've come up to me saying that they can't even go out and speak their mind in the classroom. They can't express themselves, and if they're not being able to express themselves in a classroom environment, in a safe zone, in a safe setting, then that is something that we should be worried as teachers, as community members, as politicians, because we have introduced this prevent policy and we are enforcing this upon teachers to look out for those students who have extremist views, radical views, but no training has been given us to kind of spot this radicalism. It's just trying to spot out and look for those students who have got that. So students have come up to me and said they're not able to express themselves in the classroom, which is very, very unfortunate and sad, because if this is what we're putting upon our youth, and I firmly believe that the youth are the ambassadors of tomorrow, and if this is what we're doing and we're not allowing them to express themselves, what are we actually teaching them? Are we restricting them? Are we putting things and trying to put them into a corner that this is how you should be thinking, this is what you should be saying, you can't speak freely? What happened to freedom of expression, what Britain so speaks about, and the British values that we have? Also, I think there's a lack of education amongst other individuals who don't belong to the Muslim faith as to the Muslim faith, and that's a biggest challenge. So this is something that I think could be used to counteract, and the challenges that are being faced, they can counteract and be seen as a solution. So what I do with my organisation is go into schools and teach them about the Muslim faith. If they want to, if schools, I've been to several Catholic schools, they want to know about Eid, Ramadan, what it's about, I'm quite happy to explain that. We have the curriculum which talks about Jesus and Mary. We as Muslims believe in Hazrat Isa alayhi salam, Jesus, and Mary, Virgin Mary, is one of the revered women, sacred women in Islam, and we don't obviously as Muslims hold that against anyone. We in fact are doing the work of community cohesion, but where is it in the curriculum teaching schools about Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him? Because this is one of the things that is happening at a lower level, at grassroots levels, where in schools it's not being taught, and then there's an uproar in society and there's community conflictions, and these challenges are making it very difficult for the communities to live together. Now, the awards that I've received are for breaking down cultural barriers, and this is what I intend to do, and I will continue to do that for as long as I live. But I think it really needs to be coming not bottom up, it needs to be top down. So it needs to be politicians, journalists, like my learned peers have said on the panel. I absolutely agree with them, and I couldn't agree more. I think it needs to be really honed in from the politicians, because it is, as we have seen, politicians do play a very effective role in society and in the community.
Thank you very much, Mason. Reverend Heston, that brings me nicely to yourself. Mason, obviously, she mentioned about the wider community and how there sometimes are those misconceptions or misunderstandings because of maybe lack of information, or because they've never had that kind of interaction with somebody from the Muslim community. So in regards to that, what can we be doing as a local community to increase interactions and collaborations for promoting interfaith understanding?
I think we can make friends with each other, and that's the most powerful thing that we can do. And so much magic can happen if we're ready to put in the hard work that it takes for me and that lovely imam over there to make friends and be part of each other's lives. And I guess a particular challenge for us as leaders is if we're willing to do that, then we can set an example for others to follow. We get to go and take assemblies at our local school, and then we get to show a whole lot of school kids that an imam and a vicar can absolutely be friends and can absolutely question one another's faiths and celebrate one another's faiths, and that doesn't have to be a scary thing. So I think there's something for us as leaders, community leaders, a challenge for us to take up. Do we really want it? Because it takes time and energy to be part of each other's lives. Lovely Chef here has 1,000,001 wonderful Muslim things to do centred on this place. This place is thriving and a brilliant community centre. I'm the vicar of the church up the road. We have 10,000 million things going on as well. And so it's so easy to be caught up in our own business that we fail to reach out across the boundary and go and be part of someone else's life and make space for them in our lives. And that's so on an individual level. There's a challenge for all of us. We can do that. When there is only joy. There's so much fun to be had in being friends with lovely Lasad, who's behind that camera over there, and his beautiful wife and daughters enrich my life through their friendship. When I do this, and when I bring folks from our church to visit this lovely place, lovely Laura, lovely Adrian, lovely Josh, it's such a privilege to be in someone else's place of worship and to be welcomed so warmly. I just wish that we could share that a million zillion times over and over again with everybody who lives in this little parish, with everyone who lives in this constituency, with everyone who lives in this land, that we don't need to be afraid of others. These marvellous Muslims are actually wonderful neighbours and a blessing in our lives. Then I think on a community level, that can be influenced by I guess it's a slow approach, making friends one at a time, bringing a few people at a time to come and visit to show that this is a safe, happy place, and that is a huge privilege in my life, being someone with whom others can come to visit this place, to meet Ibi, to see that great big smile and put a human face on Muslims, and that works for each of our different faiths. Basically, we have to take the time and the trouble to go and be part of each other's lives. And if we're ready to do that, then we can make a huge difference, because that will snowball, that will spread around our parish, our neighbourhoods, our constituencies, and will transform communities. But it's not something that happens overnight, and it takes a lot of time and trouble and love and care and attention, but that's what being neighbours and friends is all about.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Reverend Heston. So, Richard, hearing from Maysoon, being a worker of the NHS and still having to prove who she is and facing that discrimination, you can call it. There's many other incidents similar to that. Last year there was a complete webinar on Muslim experience in the NHS and the discrimination that Muslim counterparts are facing in comparison to others. It's a lot more. So with all this that the local community is facing on a local level, I mean, with the Prime Minister calling Muslim women letterboxes, what responsibility do political representatives have in the fight to tackle Islamophobia so that individuals like Maysoon and others, they don't have to face this discrimination on a local level?
Well, that's an important point. It's really interesting to hear your experiences as you detailed to us, which I think is a valuable part of this discussion, to hear from people in relation to their experiences of Islamophobia. And before I was a Member of Parliament, I was an employment rights lawyer. I pursued cases against local authorities, against the NHS, against private sector companies, in relation to, amongst other things, discrimination, including discrimination against people for being Muslim. And so no institution, however much well loved in our society, however positive in general, can say that it's immune from Islamophobia or any form of racism, because if we live in a society where racism exists, and unfortunately we do, and it will manifest itself across the board in all sorts of ways. you raised the point about the comments from Boris Johnson, and it seems to me he's never fully or properly apologised for those, and he might try and pass it off as a joke, but he became famous. And what we've got now, which is really unfortunate, is this increasing kind of right-wing shock jockery, I'd call it, where it's meant to be, we're revelling in a move against so-called wokeness, we're revelling in a move against so-called political correctness gone mad. They say we can't say this, so we say it. And that's very dangerous, because whilst it boosts a certain section of society, a small section, I'd say, of very right-wing opinion, at the same time, it makes minorities, in this instance, Muslims, feel under siege in their own communities, feel as if somehow they don't belong, feel as if it's somehow fair game. Because when the people who lead our country say discriminatory things, then that's a real problem. And I think we're all for people learning, though, aren't we? Where people have said discriminatory things or held discriminatory beliefs in the past, if we want to move forward as a society, they should be encouraged to reflect upon that, realise they were wrong, and advocate against the prejudices that they formerly had. But I don't think we've seen that from the Prime Minister at all. There's a big responsibility on politicians, but I'd also say a big responsibility in relation to the newspapers as well. Some of the newspapers, really, I have to say, operate almost as hate factories, pumping out racist ideas. And sometimes I think to myself, I'm surprised more people don't hold racist beliefs, because billions of pounds go into news media that encourages people to dehumanise refugees, that encourages people to have their automatic reaction being against migrants, encourages people to be against Muslims, for example. And so actually, it's a testimony to how decent people are, that racist views aren't even more popular than they are now, in my opinion. I can't remember which newspaper it was, one of the right-wing newspapers, which means there's a few to choose from, but I remember a few years ago, a centre spread in a newspaper, and I kid you not, the headline was, maybe 10 years ago, "They bring disease." This was about refugees and asylum seekers and migrants. That kind of headline...
Is that Haley Hopkins?
No, it's a headline in a newspaper reporting on the statistics about different conditions that migrants and refugees and asylum seekers had. And that kind of headline, wouldn't be out of place in a fascistic regime. And that's encouraging hate. That's inciting hate. And so it's beholden on politicians not just to not spread racist ideas themselves, but also to speak out against the newspapers that do so. Because obviously politicians, they want to be in the newspapers, don't they, quite a lot, because they hope they're going to get more favourable coverage.
Do you think that's the reason why the government will not accept or adopt the APPG definition of Islamophobia?
I'm not sure the precise reason they won't. Others on here will be able to maybe have a better idea who had direct negotiations with them about it. But obviously they should adopt it. It's disappointing that they haven't. And what's also disappointing is that the Prime Minister hasn't fully reflected upon and fully apologised for the comments he's made, because he's not only the leader of the country, he's also an opinion former. And people basically, if they're wondering whether or not it's okay to say or think something, then if the leader of the country is saying it, that's a big sign that it's fine, isn't it? That's the biggest sign that it's fine.
Thank you. Trevor, I know you probably want to comment on this. So just before that, can I just bring in Professor Salman to hear his thoughts on this specific topic?
I think the problem is this, that there's not enough political will. And it's not just that all politicians have goodwill or good intention. I think the point you described, Richard, as a hate factories is really, really good. But another way to think about newspapers is they're also they have their own political agendas quite often in this country. And part of it is that Islamophobia is being used and manipulated to carry out a right-wing political agenda. And that's the clear... So this is really, really clear. And it's really, really interesting how many of the issues to do with Islamophobia are simply dismissed as being irrelevant, unimportant, etc., in relation to violence, in relation to academic freedoms, all sorts of things like that. So the real problem isn't so much that, the letterbox and things, it's an unfortunate comment and it's indicative of something. But it's not just the isolated incident. The Tory party still has refused to have an inquiry on hundreds of cases of Islamophobia that may have occurred in the party itself. But at the same time, our public broadcasters have never really pursued the Tory party on this issue as they've pursued the Labour Party on other issues. So there is also a question about how the relationship between certain elements of the media, certain elements of the political establishment actually converge on particular issues at the expense of Muslim citizens of this country. And I think that's something that we need to take into account.
Javed, I'll bring you on that.
Yeah, thanks. Just my personal view is that Boris Johnson will not say sorry about those comments he's made, even though he should. But there's the argument about Islamophobia itself is a bit nebulous in the framing as well. So I'm probably the closest thing to a conservative here, being a Liberal Democrat. But the issue is about why do we have to use the word Islamophobia and ascribe it to something akin to racism? Why can it not be, something in and of itself an issue? And that's down to the way the whole argument and the framing of the national narrative about where we are as a country, where we're heading. We are not the first minority community in this country that has been vilified in the way we have. We talk about the last couple of decades, but if you go back a lot longer than that, to the middle of the 18th century, the Irish, the Jews, the Scots, everybody over a period of time has been vilified or subjugated to similar behaviours in the past. But we live here, we live now, and I guess the biggest arguments around the right-wing media, I understand and I completely accept what Richard is saying about the clickbait or the race baiting of the headlines. But the substance of some of the arguments in the articles themselves are pretty sound. Not all of them, some of them are. But the issue, I think, that gets dismissed is, and conflated with the fact that this is about freedom of speech, and which is where the main proponents of the definition as an example I have a problem with, because it's about the genuine criticism of the religion, and I think that's not incompatible. There is a place there to have genuine criticism of the religion, our practices. Trevor Phillips is a name that comes up when he actually sort of made a comment about ghettoisations of the Muslim communities within the country, and the Labour Party suspended them. I know you have
I think it's just important to say this.
Yeah.
The term Islamophobia was introduced by the Runnymede Trust
20 years ago,
to be honest with it, in 1997, right? Okay, and it's after, the term actually is much older than that. The problem is this, why is it that we can not have a conversation about Islamophobia without having something to do, is it the right word? Is it the right terminology? Is it about all of these arguments are spurious. There is no one who says it's a freedom, the question about the freedom of expression comes in about, we have the right to criticise religion or something. No one says you don't have the right to criticise religion. That's not what it's about. The issue about this is why it's to argue. People who are being Islamophobic are rarely engaged in theological disputes. I'm quite happy to have a theological dispute with Heston about the Trinity and Tawheed and what that means there. And I'm sure we'll have a very civilised conversation about it.
Yeah.
But when you experience, for example, if you put down your name, if you have the same qualifications and you have a Muslim name, and you are not interviewed compared to someone who has a non-Muslim name or a Christian name is interviewed. That's nothing to do with theology. It's nothing to do with freedom of religion. When people are criticising, throwing a pig's head through a mosque or through a law shop, they're not talking about whether actually is it true that the Christ is the Son of God or not the Son of God. There's no theological dispute involved in this. So to talk about it, we should have the right to criticise religion, like all of this walk around in this world having these huge theological disputes in our heads, that's not the issue. The issue is simply one of racism. It's about the expression of Muslims. It's about whether Sister Muslim can actually wear the hijab, not being being spat at or have the hijab ripped off her hijab. One of the things about Islamophobia is all the types of racism, it is the one which targets women the most. So that's what it's about. And when they do that, or when they attack a woman for wearing the hijab, they're not engaged in a theological dispute, because I bet you they would not be doing it to a nun. So let's not mix that up.
Reverend Heston, can I just bring you on this?
I guess maybe what I want to say is something about what I'm more and more all the time realizing is the importance of being an ally in this. As someone who isn't a Muslim, to be able to stand with my Muslim brothers and sisters and friends and neighbours and speak up for them, because they've, as I keep hearing, you, dear folks, are pretty darn tired of all this Islamophobia happening, and so sometimes I can speak for you and I can stand with you against the press, against the doofuses who are pulling who are doing all sorts of horrible things. And that's what we try to do as Christians. This is something that within the Church of England we try as well as we can to do. In a week's time, I'm going to be bringing a whole troop of new vicars who have moved into Leeds, into this very room, to meet Khalid and to talk about love in a box. And I'm hoping that Lasad will sing for us and call us to prayer, and to set all these new clergy up in Leeds and in Yorkshire on a footing that says, these are our friends, these are our neighbours, our co-workers, we are allies. And so that makes a lot of direct sense here in the inner city, but a lot of the folks that you've welcomed for these days in the past are actually out in the Dales, where they probably won't ever see a Muslim person, but they do read The Sun and all these horrible newspapers, and so they then in turn are able to, when a parishioner says, oh, I read in The Sun, they're able to say, well, actually, I met Ihab, and it's really not like that. So I guess something about our place as allies, and this is what Islamophobia Awareness Month is brilliant for reminding us, that we need to do that, and we need to up our game, and we need to do it as well as we possibly can.
Professor Salman said, he said that Islamophobia is one thing which targets women probably the most. What are your thoughts on that?
Most definitely agree. I've been listening to what's being said, and I absolutely agree with that, because not only have I've had personal experience of it, but I've had members of the community come up and speak and avail their concerns. But I think what is more concerning is that with this hate crime and this crime, the fear of it, it's putting people into isolation instead of counteracting and fighting against Islamophobia, fighting against the racism. They're actually going into inclination, and they're going the other way, and they're just not wanting to raise their head above the parapet. And I sometimes find, as you can see today as well, I am the only female member on the panel, so sometimes I find I am the only female organising such events and raising my head above the parapet. So my real message is to the community itself. The Muslim women are targeted, but until these sisters do not stand up and speak for themselves, they will continue to have these repercussions. They need to stand up, they need to be members of parliament, they need to take active voices in parliamentary actions, they need to be teachers, they need to be doctors, lawyers, they need to have these role models. Whereas usually I find if I'm in a room, quite proudly, I'm proud of it, quite proudly I will probably be the only female individual who is oversubscribed and overqualified and who is going out and doing and spreading and being an active member. But my message is for these sisters to come on board and do this and join organisations such as MEND to eradicate these myths, because until these myths aren't eradicated, you will continue to increase the numbers. You need to join and reduce the numbers.
Thank you very much for that, Mason.
And now we must all phone Aisha tonight and tell her, where were you?
Absolutely, I'm disappointed.
So, unfortunately, Aisha has had some personal family issues. That's the reason why she wasn't able to attend. So she did send her apologies for that. Yes, Richard.
Yeah, just to come back in on a point about the newspapers and the concept of freedom of speech. What freedom of speech should never be justified, in my opinion, to do is to empower the powerful to kick those at the bottom of society, or those who are discriminated against. And I think if you look at the newspapers, I'm sure that MEND has got the figures and the analysis. It's very interesting, isn't it? When an awful act takes place by somebody who claims to be a Muslim, you can bet your bottom dollar that the right-wing newspapers will say, Muslim person did this. That will be the headline on many occasions. Muslim person attacks. Muslim person does this. But if an atrocious act is carried out by somebody who's not a Muslim, for example, somebody who's brought up as a Christian like myself, it'll never, quite rightly actually, it'll never be in the paper saying Christian attacks so-and-so, or Christian does this, and it's right that it doesn't, but it shouldn't be ascribed to the Muslimness of somebody who claims to be Muslim who carries out atrocious acts. It's these things, this drip, 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 which happens all the time, that when the mention of Muslim in the newspaper is disproportionately attached to something negative or something frightening, then it lodges in people's minds that Muslims are something to be worried about, that that the Muslim community is something to be afraid of, and that's where Islamophobia comes from as well, isn't it?
I'm sorry, just to add to that, I completely agree with what you're saying there. But there is a perception, because of events that have happened, that there is this default position that if something does happen, like people have already got it in their mindset, right, that it must be a Muslim that's done this. But when it comes to reality, that the actual news comes out that it was a Muslim, it just sort of confounds that situation even more. So I can see the professor nodding his head here, which is fine. But clickbait, race baiting is not a new thing, and it's always used there. So it's a commercial enterprise that has a grand agenda, but completely blaming on the right media on its own, I think it isn't enough. I think there's other elements in society that have to play. I am not victim blaming here, because I am part and parcel of this. My wife wears a hijab. She's been wearing one for long before I met her, over 20 years ago. So I've been in situations where in work, for example, we used to have a dress down day, because I used to work in a law firm. We would do a dress down day every Friday. So we put £1 into the pool and it gets sort of, submit to, we'd give that contribution to a charity. My name came up, I said, okay, I want to give it to Muslim hands. I was taken to a back room in the data centre, the most noisiest one there. Some of these people in the team, right, they're not comfortable with you giving money to a charity to them. So I said, okay, fine, I'd rather go into a charity than not. So I chose Christian Hands. And they were all fine with that. So those are the sort of experiences I've had myself firsthand. So I'm not dismissing the fact that this exists. It's been around for a long time. But I think it's too oversimplified to just simply blame the whole race baiting around just arriving media on its own. There are events that happen every single day. I mean, if you look at the panel pack that is going to be debated in the next couple of days in Parliament, and Richard, you're probably sort of part and parcel of that if you go into the debate there. It talks about the different types of crimes, the aggravating factors of Islamophobia and how that's addressed. And there is a discussion there about how do we collect and how do we ascribe these events that are happening on the ground to people of Muslim of the Muslim faith when they report it to the police, and how the police then report that, what categories under the reporting mechanisms they've got in place do they actually sort of say that this is a Muslim, Islamophobic crime, or aggravated factor is Islamophobia. And it creates a sort of construed argument that, the numbers are going up or they're going down there because of the systems that are in place that are not adequate. And I'll give you the direct example. We have got 43 police forces up and down this country. The Met was the first organisation that adopted the APPG definition of Islamophobia. Yet if you look at the systems, the way the reporting and how the Freedom of Information Act operates, you will find that they can only give you the information back in terms of the numbers of what is in the system and how it's logged, if it's easily available there, and they've got a cap on how much time and effort they can spend on collecting this information. So I did a very similar exercise around the whole, the crimes of misogyny, for example, on the back of Sarah Everard's death and Sia. And, two of the police forces in Yorkshire turned around and said that we do not have that information at hand. So we have to then go through the free text of identifying what was the reason for the call, who was sent out there, what notes were put on there, what was then logged, and that's a time-consuming effort. Islamophobia is exactly in the same situation right now there. Until we change the systems of how we adopt and how we record these type of crimes, not much will happen, and these right-wing media messages will carry on, the politicians will carry on, because, we're a scapegoat for a lot of people in a lot of places there. We're just convenient political fodder, unfortunately. And just on the back of this, and I suspect that's probably the reason why Boris Johnson, Priti Patel and all the other frontline, which I have to make a comment on, is probably one of the most diverse conservative front bench governments in modern history. will not adopt the APPG version of this, even though the spearheaded campaigners of this was the Conservative Party. As soon as they adopt it, they will find that they've got this big issue, or this white elephant in the room, that we've got all these people in our own party that are Islamophobes, and they can't have that. So it's a political decision they've made not to adopt it. Could be wrong, but that's...
Can you just mention here that the Conservatives are not here to represent themselves?
So which is why I'll sort of leave my comments there.
As yourself representing the Liberal Democrats from Calder Valley. Professor Said, I think you wanted to come in on
Yeah, I think there's just two things to say. Firstly, the idea that there's always been minorities and there's always been demonisation is kind of like a surrendering to the idea there's always going to be this racism, etc. Firstly, most people who are Muslims who are being affected by Islamophobia have already had racism, basically because they were considered to be members of ethnic minorities who were also racialized. It's not that they were always racialized, they also suffered racism without the label of Islamophobia, and they're suffering now again as a label of Islamophobia. So it's twice around. It's not a question of everyone has their turn. They're going in turns twice, if I put it like that. But I think more importantly is the idea, and I think this goes to the point that Richard made, if you were saying that there are things that Muslims have done, or a Muslim does something, Muslim commits a murder, that doesn't make it a murder sanctified, or doesn't tell us anything else about the fact there's a murder. The same way, if a Christian commits a murder, or someone who's a secularist commits a murder, it doesn't tell us very much else about it. But if you say that whatever a Muslim does represents not just them, but all Muslims, then you are actually engaged in something else than just saying this is a crime. And that's the problem, that's what makes it Islamophobia. It's the same way when you think about, we know that there are people who have committed crimes who come from ethnic minorities. But criminalization of ethnic minorities means that you're arguing that the reason why they're committing crimes is because there's something among ethnic minorities, either in their culture or in the old days, in their biology, which makes them commit that crime. And that is the real issue here. And that's what is at struggle here. And if you can't make the distinction between these two, you are not actually contributing to this fight against Islamophobia. You are actually contributing to the spreading of Islamophobia. And that is something that we've learned to do in lots of different ways around many, many disadvantaged groups, that we've started to try and disassociate their outcomes from their fixing it upon them and understanding them and in a proper context. And I think we should allow that courtesy to the Muslims as well. And I think that's really, really the key issue here.
Thank you very much, Professor Salman. I want to move on from that question. So we all know Islamophobia is an issue, and we know it is on a rise according to statistics. So I want to comment to Reverend Heston I know you've briefly touched on it already, is what do you think needs to happen on a local level to tackle Islamophobia?
I think we need to, as much as we can, just put roots down with each other, be part of each other's lives, and to open these doors and get out onto the streets. And same goes for the church, same goes for Gurdwaras. Every opportunity that we get to go looking for friendships with people who are different from ourselves, who see the world differently to the way that we do. And it's a very small scale thing. This is a parish priest's perspective rather than an MP's or a professor's perspective. But the more we do that at grassroots level, the more things can happen. And the more come visit my mosque Sundays that happen, where you open these doors, or the international food festivals that you put on, where you welcome people in and give them an amazing experience of this place. The more of those we can do, the better. The more community events we can put on where we are intentionally leading as a multi-faith group, Christmas Day meals up at All Hallows for the last few years, Love in a Box, and the food bank work that you're doing here in conjunction with the food bank work and the cafe work that we're doing at All Hallows. The more visibly we can do things together that are clearly good things, that are positive, that are changing neighbourhoods for good. And again, that just does take commitment and time and effort, which we can so easily not give if we're so busy going about our own things that we don't, we can't make the time to reach out. Yeah.
Mason, on that, obviously yourself working quite with the community on the ground level. What are your thoughts on that? What do you think needs to happen on a local level?
I agree with Reverend. I think we need to do more scriptural reasoning events, do more interfaith work. I know we are doing a lot of that in the Kirklees area where I'm from, but I think there needs to be more. We need to eradicate these preconceived assumptions, these myths. They need to be eradicated, and only once this is done can we live in harmony. We need to break down these cultural barriers, these divides. We need to make more friends. We need to open more doors, and I think once we do that, we will be in a much better position. And I think that's what we can do to move forward.
Javid, I want to bring that question onto yourself as well. What can we do? What do you think needs to happen on a local level?
On a local level, there's a lot of things that can happen, that can be done. My sister's basically an example. Basically just taking charge. I mean, one of the key things I would suggest is, and it goes back to the original question that you asked me, why Yorkshire as a region has not adopted this whole definition. And it's down to the fact that, the people generally do not know how the political systems operate. So if you want to push a motion at your local council and get them to force this onto the agenda, you basically just need 2,000 people on a petition, get a councillor to actually adopt it and get them to actually force that conversation on there, whether it happens or not, and then get them to actually give a response as to why have them done that, try to make it clear with them. So that's on the political front, and it's the same thing, lobby your local MP to actually pick up the issue and take it to Parliament. The challenge always is going to be is how do you actually get this on the legislation books and actually get it enforced. I'm not a big fan of that personally, because it doesn't help change culture, it doesn't help change behaviour, because it's all about behaviour. It's about outreach, and it's about connecting, and it's about talking to people. We need to be listening more than talking, but then it's about talking and listening to the right people. Now we keep on talking about, and the Reverend, rightly says that, and the sister saying about, interfaith community discussions there. But a lot of this stuff is happening outside of the realm of religion. These are atheists or non-religious individuals online behind the cover of a screen that are spewing all this. And print's just one strand of this. And you've got a whole raft of other areas there. So I think there's a narrative that we need to rebuild, right? That it's not okay. If you aren't willing to say something face to face there without facing the consequences, don't do it online. So the likes of, is it Help Mama? So, and then there's Mend, and there's Send, and then there's all these other ENDs out there that can actually work together, and it's about showing that collective front on the individual level. It's about organising events, activities, and it's a shame because one of the key things the social services used to be really good at are youth services, trying to get people together from different communities to, at that level, break down the barriers. It's been left to the private sector or the third sector or individuals standing up and filling up that void. And I think there's a lot more that can be done, but I think it should be better organised through some sort of central governing body like the councils or some arts council or some of the research organisations that can actually help facilitate those conversations there, because it's easier to have an outside interlocutor to come in and facilitate those conversations rather than being stuck in the mud and the trenches doing it yourself.
Thank you very much, Javid. We're having this brilliant discussion to the viewers that are watching on British Muslim TV as well. If you do have any questions or comments for our esteemed guests, any comments that you do want to give, you can comment on Facebook and also ask your questions, and we will try to get to those. And we'll continue this very important discussion after a very short break.
I think the lockdown has had a huge effect on the British Muslim community. It's had an effect on all the communities
I was quite devastated. It was quite alien to me, being stuck at home.
Safeguarding, protecting our community, our congregation was the most important thing for us. The best choice we had to make was to close the masjid.
Welcome back to this very important discussion on Islamophobia. So again, without wasting any time, I'll get straight back into the conversation. So just before the break, we did ask what we think needs to happen on a local community, and we did hear from Reverend Heston, Sister Maysoon and Javed Bashir. So I want to, the same question, I want to slightly alter that for both Professor Salman and Richard Burgeon. So firstly, if I come on to Professor Salman, what do you think? We've heard from a local level, what needs to happen. What do you think needs to happen on a national level to tackle Islamophobia?
I think one of the challenges for the APG was that it was sort of misunderstood how transformation occurs in countries, especially around racism. The legislation doesn't come first. You actually have campaigns of mobilization, education, prior to that. If you look at the anti-racist legislation, it was actually the culmination of a process rather than at the start of a process. I think one of the challenges has been the top-down approach, where you say that we will have a definition of Islamophobia, we will then enshrine that in law, and that will take care of all things. Doesn't make for the fact that there is no political will to make that happen right now. And there will be no political will unless there is change and pressure from below, unless people say, look, actually, we want something to be done about it. This happened in all kinds of discriminatory legislation. The same party, for example, which used to, was concerned about Clause 22, 21, I can't remember, about how discrimination against, for example, gay people was also becomes 10 years later able to say, well, actually, we will not discriminate in that way anymore. So you can have a transformation of these things, but it requires a transformation. And the thing about the definition that we proposed to the APG was that we wanted to make one sentence which anyone could use to understand. If you think nothing else, Islamophobia is a type of racism. You should be school children, people who work in all kinds of walks of life, whose jobs are not professional politicians or professional academics, should be able to grasp that. And it's through that kind of grasping that you can start changing the conversation and calling things out. So if you want to change things at a national level, you need to be able to say, this is what Islamophobia is, and this is why I think the men's kind of thing about calling out is so important. Unless we start calling these things out and demanding action from our representation and our representatives, we will not get anywhere. And the ultimate kind of real solution is this. Ultimately, it's about civic and political engagement. And the most important thing that communities can do is help their members and participants to become more engaged in the processes of being, in terms of either mobilizing. It's not just writing to MPs and councillors, that's an important part. But it's simply being able to draw and say, look, this is what Islamophobia is. It is racism. You have to do something about it. And keep saying that again and again and again. And you will not be listened to. You will be discarded. But you don't give up. And I think sometimes when we expect sort of instantaneous responses, is, you say, well, I wrote a letter and no one wrote to my MP or my councillor, I got a very polite letter back. And that's the end of it. No, that's not how it works. So a lot of it is hard grind. But most of it is to fix upon this simple message. Islamophobia is racism, and racism has no future in this country. That's it. And I think there's an imperative to do this, because if you don't do this, think what's happening in France. This is not far away in China, where the Uyghurs are going through a horrendous process of Islamophobia, or in Kashmir, or in the Rohingya, or in Palestine. This is in France, where organizations which, for example, have been championed against racism or Islamophobia, have been banned by the French government, where expressions of Muslimness are being under severe curtailment. And the thing why this is so dangerous is that if this is being done in France, do you not think that there are people in this country, in other countries, who say, well, if they can do it in France, why can't we do it here? The same kinds of tropes, the same kinds of themes are circulating. There is a demographic pressure. If we don't do something about Muslims, they will outpopulate us. These are kind of constant things, regardless of the reality of the situation. In the Czech Republic, there's something like less than 10,000 Muslims, but their Prime Minister is on record saying that in 10 years' time, there's going to be a Muslim apocalypse, which all the Muslims will take over Czechoslovakia. Right? Because there are so many of them. And this is the same thing being used in India. There's a billion Hindus there, but the population of Muslims is going to be take over Hindus. But these demographic pressures are, this idea of demographic bomb is constantly circulating. Islamophobia has become global, so what they often do is use examples from other countries to reinforce their local messages. We need to be aware of the fact that it's global, and we need to campaign against it, because if we do not, it is not something that cannot happen in liberal democratic societies. Trump should have been a warning, and what is happening in France quietly is another warning. What is happening in France? Organizations like men will be shut down. That's sort of the Now, whatever you may say about men, you shouldn't say anything because you invited us here. You do not want them to be shut down. You don't want mosques to be shut down. You don't want the fact that if you wear a hijab, you will not be allowed to go to school. And you can say, okay, well, I don't agree with hijabs. So the next thing is now they're complaining that Muslim female students, the length of their skirts is too long. It's not about the hijab or the skirt, it's about Muslimness. And whether you express that through a beard, or you express that through a hijab, or you just express it through eating halal food, whatever it may be, that is what is being stopped. And we are simply pretending that we should just focus upon whether we get the word right or not.
Thank you, Professor Salman. Richard, same question to yourself.
I think it's a very important question, and the view I generally take in terms of the way racism operates in society is that racism comes from the top and from the structure of our society, but change comes from below. So we can't rely upon those at the top to sort out the problem of racism or Islamophobia for us, particularly when they are quite often responsible either for pushing it themselves or standing to one side while it still exists. The examples in relation to the USA and France of Islamophobia, the USA under Trump, are very important that have just been given, because that shows that in societies similar to ours, these things can get even worse, these things can happen. We shouldn't presume that society is automatically on this upward trajectory with things getting better, racism reducing, equality improving all the time. And so on a local level and a national level, I think we need to organise. It's fantastic that so much fantastic community work is done by the different religious groups in Leeds, and obviously by non-religious groups as well, including the Muslim community working with churches and others. But the reason that's done, of course, is because people like doing good things, people like helping their neighbour. We should never think we're doing it in order to persuade people that Muslims aren't a bad thing, if you understand what I mean. Because if there were a strategy to counter the bile of the right-wing press and of some politicians by proving in practice that Muslims aren't scary and they're just, great people in our community just like we are, then that as a strategy would be doomed to failure, because you're dealing with huge organisations with lots of money behind them pumping out ideas in newspapers and the TV. So actually, it's wonderful that goes on. It needs to continue and it should be celebrated. I'm sure it makes people on a local level think, well, look, I've read this awful thing about Muslims in the newspaper, but I now know plenty of Muslims and it's a real misrepresentation in the newspaper. But we need to organise, that's my message. We need to politically organise. There are lots of anti-racist organisations out there. For example, Stand Up to Racism, Hope Not Hate, MEND and others. And we need to organise against racism. We need to agitate and campaign and protest against racism, and for the government to take action, for Parliament to take action against racism. But that's where the change comes from, and that's certainly correct when you look at history. I can't think of any time in history where progressive change was dreamt up by somebody in Parliament and then the public afterwards go, oh, do you know what, we agreed with that, that's a really good idea. It's always the other way around, isn't it? We have to build up the positive pressure for a positive, progressive change in society. We've got to make it so the people in charge, the government of whichever party it is, conclude that they have no other option than to make these anti-racist changes, because if they don't, they're going to be in the minority. That's what we need to demonstrate to them through the democratic system, that they're going to be in the minority as people uphold racism. And therefore they'll realise it's in their electoral interest, if nothing else, to push that change. And of course you'll change the minds of some politicians at the same time, but ultimately we're not just into changing minds, we're into changing the whole situation as well.
Thank you very much, Richard. We are coming to almost the final 15 minutes or so of our event, so we will come to questions from our attendees and live viewers on British Muslim TV. So firstly, if there are any attendees here who do want to ask a question, if they could kindly raise their hand and we can bring those questions. Yes, the brother at the back.
Can everyone hear me?
I'll repeat the question if you...
Yeah, I can have it. I think if we accept Islamophobia as a form of racism, I think it's the right way to go. And to understand that resisting racism has to come from every movement for racial justice in history has been led by that community. So what does Muslim political mobilisation as Muslims look like in 2021 when our community is already so securitized, seen as a danger and a threat from the outside, and where we have potentially quite a large number of internal divisions, whether to do with sectarian or to do with, for example, the trajectory of political Islam around the world and other countries. What does political mobilisation for Muslims in this country look like, and how can it succeed in the current climate?
Just to paraphrase that for our live viewers, so the brother is asking that with the Muslim community already under so much scrutiny and facing this discrimination, what does political mobilisation look like for the Muslims, and how should the Muslim community mobilise politically to tackle Islamophobia? So if I could start with Reverend Heston.
Can I defer to this wise, wonderful man on my left?
A lot of wonderful men on your left. I think that, sorry, just very, very quickly, two very important methods. Firstly, we need to educate ourselves with examples of where those sorts of things have succeeded. So if you look at the African American experience of civil rights struggle, don't tell me they were not scrutinized or fragmented or suppressed. So if they were able to achieve that mobilization, then there's always hope. There's also the history of anti-colonial struggles that many of our parents or grandparents were involved in, which was also under securitization, on fragmentation, when there were many, many people who were co-opted into the colonial racial authorities. So the struggle will always be difficult if you are this, the weaker party in that. But if we can be inspired by those examples, then we can be creative about thinking about how we can engage in these things. One thing that I always say is that we invest a lot in our children's education or religious education, or going to the madrasa, learning how to pray, which are really, really important. But I also think we should have a better sense of Muslim history, because if that also widens your range and diet of examples, we should have a better sense of civics. And I think the madrasa should be teaching civics, they should be teaching history, so that we know that there are those who have experienced these situations, perhaps worse situations, and they have been able to come up with answers. And you become inspired by those answers. So I don't have a simple answer, because I think everything's been said in terms of practically. It's not rocket science. The most important thing is to get involved. Islamophobia is not caused by ignorance, it's caused by idiots. And by idiots is what the Greeks called people who didn't want to engage in public life. And Islamophobia is caused by people not engaging in public life, in trying to change our common things. And that, I think, is the best solution for any kind of struggle for justice, is to be involved in that struggle for justice. Whether it's through organising charity events, it's organising, mobilisations. It needs to be organised, it needs to be committed, and it needs to be consistent. That's what I would suggest.
Thank you, Professor Salman. Javed Bashir, can I just bring you on that very quickly, just a minute?
Well, if I understood the question, what does political mobilisation look like in the 21st century? This is it, this panel, having this conversation, getting people from different spectrums of life together on one stage, and having these conversations and challenging the narrative that's out there that's being perpetuated by certain few vested interests. But whatever it is, the key message that I would say is we have to be careful of not to be inside an echo chamber where we're just talking to ourselves, because the problem isn't within us, it's with others that have a problem with us in the frame of Muslims, Muslimness and Islamophobia and all those type of bigoted views that are out there. And there's plenty of them. And there's examples as soon as you walk out there, pick up your phone, Facebook, social media, it's there, it's right in front of you. Many people choose to ignore it because it's easier to just live your life and carry on and not be part of that and just protect your own. But whatever it is we're going to do, it's got to be done soon, because one of the cornerstones of a thriving liberal democracy is the fact that you can actually challenge your elected officials and hold them to account. So in the new Police and Crimes Bill, the fact that the government's looking at restricting protests and going out there and challenging these issues is a big issue that we need to be taking from the centre issue with.
Thank you, Javed. So we have a question on Facebook comment from Sister Saima. She asked that, does there need to be a unanimous support for a definition of Islamophobia, such as the definition proposed by the APBG amongst Muslim communities? So Richard, could I come on to you?
Well, I think what the Professor has outlined in relation to that makes a lot of sense, because if people don't understand what something is, then they're not necessarily going to spot it or take the action against it. And so I think having a common understanding of Islamophobia, is useful. But just to make a quick point about the previous question, I do think it's incredibly important that any anti-racist struggle is led by the community at the forefront of that. So, anti-Semitism, it's quite right that the Jewish community, at the sharp end of that, experiencing it, leads it. With the Muslim community, it's vitally important that the Muslim community, not people like myself, who are lucky enough to represent an area which includes the thriving Muslim community, has to be the community itself that leads the struggle against Islamophobia. It's the role of myself and other elected politicians and elected representatives, but also just people in the community more generally, to support them in that struggle. And through history, I think it's really important that the black civil rights movement in the United States was mentioned. It was, that was led by black people. In every society where there's been that struggle for equality, the most effective campaigns have always been led by those at the forefront of it. And part of that has to be, of course, a definition, so that society more widely understands what they are campaigning against.
Thank you very much, Richard. Come back to our attendees. The brother has a question.
I work quite closely with Mr. Husky. I met him at the church. I worked in the homeless sector. And he helped a lot of Syrians when they first came to the refugees country. It's been tears in my eyes, because that's a wonderful thing that he ever done in a way. What I'm saying is, what I'm doing here is quite useful. But as a community, I think we are nowhere near what we're thinking we want to know. And I can see what Brother Huston is saying there, is the community needs to do more. Now, how do we do that? We need some money for that. Yeah, that's the main thing that comes down to that, is money. Yeah, funding.
Yeah.
We have a lot of money from ourselves. And I do a lot of work here in the mosque.
Yeah.
Yeah, I used to go as a driver, bring in their problems and see what they're facing, what they need. Poverty is a big one, if they can afford it. Yeah. So Islamophobia is the main big issue, we know that.
Absolutely.
How do you deal with it?
So I think the brother did mention more sort of a comment than an actual question, is that we do need to work more as a community for that. But from what the brother did say, Sister Maysoon, the question that does come is, as a Muslim community, what can we do? How do we raise that support? And how do we get the Muslim community to stand up against Islamophobia and to be actively involved in tackling Islamophobia?
I think it's a double-edged sword, Brother Abu Bakr, if I'm being absolutely honest. I always find that as a Muslim community, why is it that we have to work double, triple, quadruple the amount to the other faiths? So let's take a terrorist attack, for example. If it's committed by a Muslim individual, we will have the Muslim community that will go out in droves and they will say, not in my name, and quite rightfully not in our name, because Islam is such a beautiful religion of peace. But let's take, on the other hand, if we have a Christian who commits a terrorist attack, like we had in New Zealand, was there Christian groups going out and saying, not in our name? No, there wasn't. What they did was show community cohesion by just supporting the Muslim community who were going through the attacks and who had bereaved family members who'd gone through, somebody who had been killed in that attack. So what I feel as a community, what we can do is support each other. And I kind of go back to what I was saying earlier on in the panel. Instead of going into inclination and kind of going into seclusion and not doing anything about it, raise your head above the parapet. Feel that you need to do something. And if it is funding, brother, that you're saying that you need, there are several funding groups that you can apply for funding to. Local community grants, your local council, you can apply for grants, get that support, and if that is what you need, that is what you need. We need to work as a community together and come together, because I firmly believe it's not us and them, it's us united. We need to work together in order to eradicate Islamophobia. That's the only way we can move forward.
Thank you very much for that, Maysoon. Reverend Hester, we have another question. Is do you feel that COVID has had an impact on minority communities?
From what I can see, yes, of course. And I think, as we've maybe said already, something like a pandemic will definitely have a harder impact on people who are less privileged in life, for sure. So yes, and I think I'm probably therefore the worst person to answer a question like this. But from what I've seen, yes, of course. And it's made it also more difficult for us to see that. All the difficulties, the problems that come our way in the middle of the pandemic get hidden away, whether it's discrimination against ethnic minority people, or whether it's domestic violence. All these things get hidden away behind closed doors, so it's more difficult to tell. So therefore it's probably way more than any of us can realise. But even from the glimpses that I get, yes, definitely.
Professor Mann, can I comment to you on that? Do you think COVID has impacted the rise of Islamophobia?
I think the issue about COVID is that it's exacerbated existing inequalities in society, and I think that's true. Has it impacted Islamophobia? Well, it's given another narrative to talk about how Muslims are responsible for COVID. For example, I was doing the rounds in India, it was explained as that basically the Jamaat al-Tablighi and Muslims mixing in mosques was causing COVID, spreading COVID, etc. So it adds a little bit more, and one more story. No doubt there are Islamophobes out there trying to blame the climate change on Muslims as well. So I think that's true, but I think the real issue is this, that COVID as an affected society has shown the vulnerabilities of the most vulnerable. And it has shown that society remains racially divided. If you look at, for example, especially early on, how many people, even in the NHS, why was it so many people from ethnic minority backgrounds who were actually dying of COVID? There was a grossly overrepresentation given the numbers. It shows then how their housing conditions they're living in. It shows many other issues that in this, Britain remains a society which is divided through social and economic matters, and that those divisions are overlaid by racism, and Islamophobia is a factor in that. So I think that's what it illustrated.
Thank you.
Could I just chip in conversely to this? During COVID, we turned our community cafe into a food bank. And these dear brothers and sisters collected food for us, and so did the brothers and sisters at Mecca Mosque. And every time someone Muslim popped up to deliver food for us, that creates so much goodwill. So there are, we're talking about Islamophobia and the idiots, but actually the vast majority of our neighbours are not idiots. They actively want community cohesion, and they want good things. They want to think good of Muslims and Christians and everybody together. So there is a counter good news to the bad news.
Thank you very much for that, Reverend Heston. So we are coming to the end of our discussion today, and this discussion around Islamophobia will continue throughout this month of November, beginning from tomorrow. So if yourself, if you are part of an organisation or as an individual, a school, university, or any other organisation that you may be, businesses that do want to get involved and they do want to raise this awareness of Islamophobia, then you can have your own event, have some form of training. Please, you can get much more information, resources, and you can find all that on www.islamophobia-awareness.org, and you can get involved. There are numerous events happening as well across Yorkshire you can get involved in, and thank you very much for tuning in.